The intent of this video is to address the impact long-range fighter escorts had on the survivability rate of bombers in World War II. This declassified chart from a 1955 USAF Historical Division Research Studies Institute document titled Development of Long-Range Escort Fighter summarizes the bomber escort situation the U.S. faced in World War II. The U.S. entered World War II without a long-range fighter. This type of aircraft would have escorted bombers. This gap in long-range escort coverage existed until late 1943. This equates to 16 months of U.S. bombing missions without long-range fighter escort. The failure to develop a long-range fighter is considered one of the most serious planning errors in World War II. Bombers could not defend themselves during deep penetration raids without significant losses. The failure to develop a long-range fighter is considered a major blunder, as addressed on this chart from a 1983 Office of the Air Force history document titled Army Air Forces in World War II, Volume 6. The Air Force planning committees assumed the bomber did not need fighter escort, so none was developed. The theory that the bombers could furnish their own protection was false and costly, as discussed on this 1947 Air Force Historical Studies document titled The Combined Bomber Offensive. The story of the P-51 is considered one of the most costly mistakes made by the Army Air Forces in World War II. The 8th U.S. Army Air Forces operated out of Great Britain, and the 15th U.S. Army Air Forces operated out of Italy. The 8th is roughly 1.5 times the size of the 15th. The 8th operated in the European theater, and the 15th operated in the Mediterranean theater. They both operated B-17s and B-24s. This video will focus on the effect the fighter escorts had on the heavy bombers of the 8th. This chart from a declassified 1945 document titled Statistical Summary of the 8th Air Force's Operations August 17, 1942 through May 8, 1945 outlines the 8th fighter and bomber loss rates. The x-axis is a month and year. The y-axis is the loss rate in percent per credit sorties from 0 to 10. The curves in the body of the chart are for fighters and bombers. To assess the impact long-range fighter escorts had on bomber losses, we will need to recreate this chart with the following changes. Heavy bomber losses only, no medium bombers. Only include bomber losses due to enemy aircraft attacks. Need to remove bomber losses due to flak and other categories. This table from a 1945 Office of Statistical Control document titled Army Air Forces Statistical Digest lists the number of bombers and fighters lost in the European theater. We will only extract the data from heavy bombers lost by enemy aircraft. The number of credited sorties per month and year can be found on this table. The results of processing the data can be seen on this chart. The x-axis is a month and year from August 1942 through May 1945. The y-axis is a percentage of U.S. 8th Army Air Force's B-17s and B-24s lost per month due to enemy aircraft alone. This chart shows a range of various U.S. fighters from a 1945 Headquarters 65th Fighter Wing 8th Air Force document titled U.S. 8th Air Force Strategic Fighters vs. German Flak ETO. The P-47s could reach a combat range as shaded here as of July 1943. This page shows the bombing city target locations from June through December 1943. The maximum range of the P-47s as of July 43 is shaded here. Most of these target cities are outside the range of fighter escort. The 1943 bomber loss rate due to enemy aircraft bounced around from a high of 7.5% in April to a low of 1.5% in December. Part of the April 1943 chart spike is due to the loss of 16 out of the 115 bombers sent to the Focke-Wulf aircraft plant in Bremen on the 17th. Bremen is well outside the range of fighter escorts. 3 of the most significant turning points of the bombing campaign occurred during the second half of 1943. The first event occurred on June 22nd when General Arnold ordered General Giles to develop a long-range fighter. Snippets of his order are shown here. Within 6 months, you are to have a fighter available to protect the bombers. This can be a modified existing fighter or a new design. This is your problem to solve. The range requirements require it to escort bombers to Germany and back by January 1944. The second significant event occurred on August 17, 1943, when 376 bombers were dispatched to bomb the ball bearing factory at Schweinfurt and the Messerschmitt Aircraft Factory in Regensburg. This map outlines the Schweinfurt-Regensburg air battle that took place from a 1945 Assistant Chief of the Air Staff intelligence document titled Strategic Air Victory in Europe. The thin black lines are the German enemy aircraft routes attacking the unescorted bombers. Each dot on the map represents the loss of a heavy bomber. There are 60 dots. 25 bombers were lost supporting the Regensburg raid and 35 supporting the Schweinfurt raid. This represents 19% of the attacking force. The significant third event occurred when 60 bombers were lost supporting another raid to the Schweinfurt ball bearing factory on October 14, 1943, just 2 months later. The losses from these two raids led to the most serious crisis the Army Air Forces faced in World War II. The 8th had lost air superiority. This could only be regained with long-range fighter escorts. The bomber losses of these two missions proved that U.S. heavy bombers could not conduct deep penetration raids without fighter escort. This was a turning point in the bomber war. All unescorted deep bomber penetration raids stopped after the Schweinfurt II mission, as discussed on this page from a 1945 8th Air Force Tactical Development Document. Long-range fighter escorts became available in January of 1944, and long-range escorted bomber missions started a month later in February of 1944. Between mid-October 1943 and February 1944, bombing missions were conducted, but the distances were limited to that of the existing fighter escorts. So what caused the large drop in bomber loss rates from 6.4% to 2% between October of 1943 and February of 1944? The reduction in bomber loss rates was due to the following 5 reasons. Limit the bombing raid depths to the range of the existing escorts. Increase in blind bombing. Larger number of bombings participating to saturate German defenses. Revise bomber formations. The German Air Force revising formation attack tactics. In September 1943, the 8th started sighting their targets by radar or blind bombing by the PFF or Pathfinder Force. Losses due to enemy aircraft were about 1/3 the losses of normal target visual sighting with the Norton bomb sight. The lower loss rates in November and December 1943 were due to a significant amount of bombing that occurred by the radar Pathfinder Force. The reduction in losses in November and December 1943 were also due to fighter escorts staying out of flak range and sending a large force of bombers to saturate the target. The 54 aircraft combat wing was replaced by the more manageable compact 36 aircraft combat box in January of 1944. This change was easier to fly, better gun visibility, and easier to escort. On December 17, 1943, the German Air Force changed their bomber attack tactics with disastrous effects. Goering ordered the German bomber interceptors to attack the bombers while ignoring the fighter escorts. They were to attack from the rear and open fire within 400 meters. Our gunners were trained to open fire at 600 yards. This was catastrophic for the fighters. German loss rates were between 50 and 70%. Some German pilots ignored this order. German pilots would rather attack the escorts first. The escorts flew above and on the sides of the bombers. The German pilot corps morale suffered. This image shows the typical fighter escort formation protection zones. The fighters weave back and forth to maintain their position relative to the formation's indicated airspeed of 150 to 155 miles per hour. This chart shows a type and number of 8th Air Force operational fighters available per month. Observations of the data include the P-47 was a dominant fighter until April 1944. P-51s were the dominant fighter from May 1944. P-38s were phased out by November 1944. This page illustrates the radius of action of fighters from an August 1945 Air Technical Service Command document titled Tactical Planning. Flying escort can be an opportunity for bomber gunners to mistake your U.S. fighters for an enemy interceptor. As a rule of thumb, bomber gunners will open fire at any fighter that points its nose at you and is within range. So what impact did the long-range fighter escorts have on the bomber loss rates due to enemy aircraft? An Air Evaluation Board study concluded unescorted B-24s will be lost or damaged at a level 4 times that of an escorted bomber. The study included a comparison of unescorted and escorted missions for justification of the results. General Ira Aker indicated escorts will reduce the bomber loss rates by 50 to 75%. The overall bomber loss rate due to enemy aircraft for the time period of August 1942 through January 1944 equates to 3.1%, and 0.6% for the time period February 1944 through May 1945. I believe there is sufficient data to conclude the escorted bomber loss rate to enemy aircraft is around one-fourth that of an unescorted bomber. 876 bombers were lost to enemy aircraft up to January 1944, prior to the introduction of long-range escorts. It would be, though, difficult to pin down with any confidence how many of these 876 bombers could have been saved had long-range fighter escorts been available from the beginning of operations, given the various other loss rate influences discussed. So what did the Germans think of the bombers' long-range fighter escorts? Hermann Goering was asked why the German Air Force couldn't stop the U.S. bombers. He indicated that the long-range fighter was the reason for the Air Force's success over the Reich. The unescorted bomber campaign would have failed. Nobody thought long-range fighters were possible. When long-range bombers appeared over Berlin, he knew the results would be tragic. After the war, German Air Force officers all indicated the turning point in the daylight bombing campaign occurred when long-range fighters appeared. In summary, the neglect of developing a long-range fighter escort can be considered a travesty. Once the long-range fighter escort was available, the bomber loss rate from enemy aircraft dropped to around 25% of the unescorted bomber. The German credited the long-range escort as a major turning point in the air war over the Reich. If you are flying escort, do not point your nose towards a bomber formation. If you found this video worthy of your time, please consider commenting, liking, and/or subscribing to the channel World War II U.S. Bombers.